There is a quiet mistake that harms a lot of plants in backyard gardens. It is not always a lack of water. It is not always a lack of sunlight. And it is not always because you have not bought the right fertilizer. The mistake is this. You see yellow leaves, and you start feeding blindly. Older leaves turning yellow, yellow leaves with green veins, or a tomato with a dark sunken patch at the bottom. These are not the same problem. They are different signals. So if your first question is, what fertilizer should I use? You may already be starting in the wrong place. The better question is, what is this plant trying to tell me? In this video, you are going to learn how to read those signals, match each symptom with the right natural remedy, and make 5 zero-cost garden tonics from the scraps already sitting in your kitchen. Before you pull out a plant that looks like it is declining, look at its leaves one last time, because it may not be dead. It may simply be speaking a language you were never taught how to read. But before we start reading each individual sign, there is one very important principle to remember. The leaves are the plant's first alarm bell, but they are not the final verdict. A yellow leaf does not automatically mean the plant is starving for fertilizer. It could be a cry for help because the plant is running low on nitrogen, magnesium, or iron. But it could also be the result of overwatering, root damage, lack of sunlight, pest pressure, or simple shock after days of uneven watering. That is why so many gardeners work harder and harder while their plants keep getting weaker. Not because they do not care, not because they are not trying, but because they are accidentally reading the signal the wrong way. So in this video, we are going to leave behind the old habit of seeing yellow leaves and immediately pouring on fertilizer. Instead, we will follow one rule. First, look at the symptom. Second, suspect the possible cause. Third, check again. And only after that, choose the right remedy. That is the line between someone who feeds by guesswork and someone who truly begins to understand the language of their own garden. There is a simple scientific principle behind this. A plant does not grow according to the nutrient it has the most of. It is limited by the one thing it lacks the most. Picture plant growth like a wooden barrel made from many different staves. One stave is nitrogen, one is potassium, another is calcium, magnesium, or water. The water inside the barrel never rises to the height of the tallest stave. It spills out at the lowest one. Plants work the same way. Even if everything else is abundant, one missing piece can stop growth right at that weak point. That is why giving more nitrogen to a plant that is really short on potassium may only make it greener without ever helping it flower or fruit. Pouring fermented rice water onto a plant that is short on magnesium may improve the soil, but the leaves can still keep fading. And sprinkling a mountain of eggshells around a tomato with blossom end rot caused by uneven watering may do almost nothing at all. Feeding correctly is not just about choosing the right ingredient. Feeding correctly begins with understanding the real problem. So before choosing any garden remedy, look closely and ask yourself, which stave in this barrel is the shortest? And the first sign is easy to miss because it begins where very few gardeners look closely, at the lowest part of the plant. It begins when the older leaves near the bottom start turning yellow first. At first, the change is almost too small to notice. The leaves simply look a little paler. That deep, healthy green begins to fade into a lighter green. Then, slowly, the entire leaf starts to turn yellow. The stem is still standing. The plant is still alive. But it no longer pushes out new growth the way it should. It looks tired, almost as if it has used up its last reserve of strength. If you see the older leaves near the bottom turning yellow first, while the newer leaves at the top are still greener, the plant may be sending you one of the most common signals in the garden. It is running low on nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the core nutrients a plant needs to build chlorophyll, grow stems, produce leaves, and push out tender new shoots. And when nitrogen runs short, the plant is forced to make a survival decision. It protects the young growth first. Because nitrogen is a highly mobile nutrient inside plant tissue, the plant can move it from one place to another. So when the soil no longer provides enough, the plant begins to pull nitrogen out of the older leaves near the bottom and send it upward to feed the growing tips. The result is simple. The older leaves are sacrificed first. They lose their green color first. That is why this deficiency rarely begins at the top of the plant. It usually begins down below. But this is the important part. Not every yellow leaf means nitrogen deficiency. If the leaf turns yellow between the veins, while the veins stay green, That may be a magnesium story. If the entire plant yellows at once, the base smells sour or damaged, and the roots turn soft and brown, the problem may be waterlogged roots, not a lack of fertilizer. If yellow leaves come with spots, curling, or distortion, you need to check for pests and disease before adding anything to the soil. True nitrogen shortage has one clear pattern. The plant looks pale, growth slows down, and the older, lower leaves turn yellow first. And when the plant truly needs nitrogen, you do not always have to reach for an expensive bag of fertilizer. One of the richest sources may already be sitting at the bottom of your refrigerator: overripe tomatoes, soft cucumbers, wilted greens, old cabbage leaves, or the vegetable scraps you were about to throw away. Scientifically speaking, these soft, green, water-rich scraps have a low carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. In plain language, they break down quickly and can release nutrients much faster than dry leaves, woody stems, or sawdust. Here is the method. Chop the spoiled vegetables into small pieces. Place them in a plastic bucket. Cover them completely with water. Use a plate or a small weight to keep the scraps fully submerged beneath the surface. Cover the bucket, place it in a shaded spot, and let it ferment for about 2 weeks. Inside that bucket, a process called mineralization begins. The plant cells start to break apart. The nitrogen locked inside those tissues is released and pulled into the water. After 2 weeks, strain off the liquid. And this is where many gardeners make the biggest mistake. Natural does not mean harmless. This fermented liquid should never be used straight. Dilute it heavily, about 1 part fermented liquid to 30 parts clean water. Then pour it gently around the root zone, where the roots can take it up slowly. If the brew is too strong, it can shock the roots. If you spray it directly on the leaves under the sun, it can burn them. And if the plant is yellow because the soil is waterlogged and the roots are already weak, adding more liquid can push the plant even closer to collapse. So the rule is simple. Dilute it well. Pour it at the root zone. Apply it in the early morning or late afternoon, and only use it when the soil is not already waterlogged. If the real problem is nitrogen deficiency, and the root system is still healthy, the plant may begin pushing new growth and greening up within a few days to a week. But remember, this is not magic. This is simply giving the plant the thing it was actually missing. And that is exactly why we have to look closely. Because if that older leaf is turning yellow, but its veins are standing out in a darker green, then the plant is sending an entirely different signal. And now, let's look at a situation that confuses a lot of gardeners. The plant is not yellow. It is not stunted. In fact, it may be lush, green, and full of leaves. But the flowers keep dropping, the fruit is scarce, and the plant seems to be feeding its leaves instead of feeding its crop. This kind of plant brings a very specific kind of disappointment. You wake up every morning, water it, protect it from the sun, and watch it grow taller with hope. From a distance, it looks almost perfect. The leaves are deep green. The stems are thick. It looks like the plant is in the strongest stage of its life. But the truth is scattered on the soil beneath it. Only a few flowers appear here and there. The blossoms that opened yesterday are already lying around the base of the plant. Tiny fruits begin to form, and then simply stop growing. It feels as if the plant has betrayed all the care you gave it, pouring all of its strength into growing leaves while forgetting how to grow fruit. When a plant is slow to fruit, our instinct is impatience. We think it is not strong enough, so we keep feeding it. But if what you are adding at that moment contains too much nitrogen, you may be locking the flowering door shut with your own hands. A plant does not need the same menu at every stage of life. When it is young, it is hungry for nitrogen to build stems and leaves. But when it reaches maturity, when it is ready to flower and set fruit, its needs change completely. In plant science, there is a concept known as nutrient antagonism. Picture nitrogen and potassium like two passengers trying to squeeze through the same narrow doorway at the roots. When you give the plant too much nitrogen, that flood of nitrogen can crowd the system, pushing the balance away from potassium. And what happens then? The plant receives the wrong signal. It acts as if it is still in its growing years. It keeps reaching upward. It keeps making thick stems and heavy leaves. But the pathways that move sugars and energy toward the flowers, the work potassium helps support, are no longer keeping up. Without enough energy, the flowers drop. The young fruits stay small, weak, and more likely to split as they ripen. But remember our rule of diagnosis. Blossom drop is not always caused by low potassium or too much nitrogen. Flowers can fall because the nights are too hot or too cold, Because there are not enough bees or pollinators. Because watering has been uneven. Because the plant is not getting enough light. So before you intervene, make sure your garden is not being shocked by weather, water, or the environment. If the growing conditions are normal, and the plant truly needs a gentle push toward flowering and fruiting, then we turn to a light mineral extract from the kitchen, onion peel tea. The method is very simple. Take a handful of dry onion skins. Place them in a jar of clean water for 24 to 48 hours. When the water turns a golden brown, almost like amber, the minerals have begun to move into the liquid. To use it, pour the liquid around the base of the plant in the early morning or late afternoon. Unlike fermented vegetable scrap fertilizer, onion peel tea is much gentler. During the flowering and young fruit stage, you can use it once or twice a week, about 1 large cup, roughly 200 milliliters per plant. Think of it as steady support, a way to help the plant hold its flowers and carry its young fruit with more strength. Not as a harsh stimulant, not as a shortcut, and certainly not as some toxic push that forces the plant beyond what it can handle. And when we talk about potassium, we cannot ignore banana peels. But I need to make one thing very clear. Simply tearing up a banana peel and soaking it in water overnight does not create a fast-acting potassium fertilizer, no matter how many internet tips promise it does. That water is mostly a weak extract, with a little sugar and plenty of room for smelly bacteria to grow. Banana peels only release their real value when they are chopped small and composted into the soil, or when they are added to the recovery brew later in this video, where microbes have time to break them down properly. So, when a plant is all leaves and very few flowers, stop adding more nitrogen. Stabilize the watering. Make sure pollination and sunlight are not the problem. And then support the plant gently with onion peel tea. But even after your plant moves past this stage, even after it flowers and begins forming fruit that looks perfect from the outside, another harsh surprise may still be waiting. It happens when you excitedly lift the fruit and suddenly see a dark, sunken patch carved deep into the bottom. This may be one of the most heartbreaking moments for any gardener. You have cared for that plant since it was just a seedling. From above, the tomato looks almost perfect. The color is beautiful. The shape is round and full. But when you gently turn the fruit over, a dark, sunken patch at the bottom ruins everything. At first, it may be nothing more than a small spot, slightly water-soaked. Then that area grows darker. It dries out. It sinks inward. And it looks exactly as if the fruit is breaking down from the bottom up. The first reaction for most gardeners is panic. The plant has a fungal disease. I need to buy a spray right away. But the truth is, in most cases, this is not a spreading disease at all. This is blossom end rot. And blossom end rot is directly connected to calcium. In plants, calcium acts almost like cement. It helps build and stabilize the cell walls. When a fruit is growing quickly and does not receive enough calcium, the tissues at the farthest end of the fruit, the blossom end, become weak. They break down. They collapse. And that collapse becomes the dark, sunken patch you see at the bottom. That is why this problem often appears on tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, squash, and other fast-growing fruiting plants during their most intense growth stage. But here is the most important part, the part many gardening videos online either get wrong or leave out. Seeing blossom end rot does not automatically mean your soil is short on calcium. Many gardens already have plenty of calcium in the soil, and the fruits still turn black at the bottom. Why? Because calcium is a very stubborn mineral. It does not move freely on its own. It has to travel with the flow of water from the roots upward through the plant. When watering is uneven, when the soil goes bone dry one day and waterlogged the next, when the roots are weak, or when too much nitrogen pushes the plant into heavy leaf growth, that flow of water is interrupted. And when the weather gets too hot, the plant may send most of its water to the leaves just to cool itself down, stealing that flow away from the fruit. When the water stops, calcium stops with it. The young fruit is suddenly left hungry for calcium, and the bottom begins to collapse. Once you understand that, two hard truths become very clear. First, a fruit that already has blossom end rot will not heal. Do not waste energy hoping it will recover. Remove it. Let the plant stop spending strength on damaged fruit and give it a chance to protect the next flush. Second, crushing a few eggshells and sprinkling them around the plant today will not save tomorrow's fruit. Plants do not eat solid materials. They take up minerals dissolved in water. Large broken pieces of eggshell can sit in the soil for a very long time before they break down enough to matter. Eggshells are not useless, but they are a long-term soil-building material, not an emergency cure. If you want to use them, rinse them clean, dry them well, and grind them into a very fine powder before mixing them into soil or compost. The finer the powder, the easier it is for soil life to work on it over time. But remember this clearly: with blossom end rot, eggshells are only half the answer. The other half is steady watering. Calcium cannot enter the fruit if the flow of water through the plant keeps breaking. So instead of panicking, follow this strategy. First, remove the damaged fruits. Next, keep the root zone evenly moist. Then, cover the soil with straw, dry leaves, or compost so the roots are not shocked by heat and moisture swings. At the same time, avoid overfeeding with nitrogen. And finally, use finely ground eggshells only as a long-term mineral support for the soil ahead. Nitrogen, magnesium, potassium, and calcium. They are all essential pieces of the plant nutrition puzzle. But sometimes you have done everything right. The soil has nutrients. The watering is steady. The surface is mulched and protected. And still, the plant looks weak. The leaf edges turn dry and brown. The branches droop. That is because the plant may not be missing one specific nutrient at all. It may be under stress. And stress is the quiet cry for help that many gardeners misdiagnose the most. Now we are entering a much harder group of signals. This is no longer just yellow leaves. And it is no longer the simple story of one missing nutrient. At this point, the edges of the leaves begin to burn brown. Some leaves curl tightly inward. The whole plant droops in the middle of the day. Flowers drop heavily after a wave of heat. Some leaves turn dry and brittle, almost as if they have been baked under the sun. And when most gardeners see this, their first instinct is almost always the same. The plant is thirsty, or the plant needs fertilizer. So they grab the watering can. Or worse, they mix up a strong bucket of fertilizer and pour it straight into the soil. But please, this is exactly the moment when you need to slow down. Do not let panic fool you. From a plant physiology point of view, brown leaf edges and curled leaves are among the easiest symptoms to misread. In many cases, they are not a direct cry for fertilizer. They are the plant's last line of defense. When temperatures rise too high, the plant can lose water pressure inside its cells faster than the roots can replace it. To survive, it begins shutting down the breathing pores on its leaves. It sacrifices the outer edges of the leaves, the parts farthest from the main flow of water. It curls inward to reduce the surface area exposed to the sun. A drooping plant is not always thirsty. Sometimes, drooping is a temporary protective response. And sometimes, the soil is already soaked, but the roots are suffocating from a lack of oxygen. They are suffocating underground, unable to pull water upward. So the plant wilts while standing in wet soil. And here is the cruelest truth. Pouring fertilizer onto a shocked plant is one of the fastest ways to damage it further. Chemically speaking, fertilizer is salt. And when the roots are already weak, exhausted, or damaged, adding a strong dose of fertilizer can create osmotic stress. Instead of feeding the plant, that concentration of salts can pull the little water left inside the roots back out into the soil. The plant is not nourished. It is drained, and the burned edges, dry leaves, and collapse can spread even faster. When a plant is under stress, the first goal is not to make it grow. The first goal is to bring it back to stability. So before you mix any fertilizer, run through this 5-step survival check. First, is the soil too dry? Do not be fooled by the surface. Push your finger a few inches down into the soil, because the top may look bone dry while the root zone is still moist. Second, is the soil too wet? If the soil is constantly soggy, sticky, heavy, or smells sour and airless, the roots may be suffocating from a lack of oxygen. Third, are the roots trapped? Plants that have been sitting in pots for a long time, heavy soil, compacted soil, and poor drainage can all push roots toward this danger zone. Fourth, turn the leaves over. Are there aphids, thrips, or spider mites feeding underneath? These tiny enemies rarely sit openly on the top of the leaf. They hide on the underside. Fifth, has the plant just been hit by hot wind, sudden harsh sun, or a dose of fertilizer that was too strong? After you check those things, act gently. If the soil is dry, water slowly and deeply in the early morning or late afternoon. Do not sprinkle a little water over the surface again and again. If the sun is too intense, give the plant temporary shade. And always mulch around the base with straw, dry leaves, or compost to help keep soil temperature and moisture more stable. Only when the environment has been corrected, and only then, should we support the plant lightly with nutrition. An onion peel tea is one of the gentlest options. Let's call it what it is: a light mineral extract, not a disease cure, not a magical immune system. Inside those thin onion skins are small amounts of potassium and plant compounds, such as quercetin compounds, that may help support a plant under stress when used gently and correctly. Soak a handful of dry onion skins in cool water for 24 to 48 hours. Strain off the amber-colored liquid. Then pour it around the root zone in the cool of the evening. The goal is not to force the plant to explode with new growth overnight. The goal is to comfort and support it while you bring its growing conditions back into balance. Let me say it again. When a plant is under stress, put the fertilizer bag away. Stabilize the water. Reduce the shock. Check the roots. Check the underside of the leaves. And only then support the plant gently with minerals. If only one or two plants are stressed, you can treat them one at a time. But if your entire garden is struggling, if every plant you put in the ground grows slowly, stays stunted, and never seems to thrive, if the soil dries out almost immediately after watering, or the water runs off without soaking in, if the ground is hard as stone and pale from exhaustion, then the problem has moved beyond onion skins or eggshells. At that point, the plants are not the only ones in trouble. The soil beneath your feet is losing its life. If only one plant has yellow leaves, you might suspect a nitrogen shortage. If a few leaves are turning yellow between the veins, you may start thinking about magnesium. If a tomato has a dark patch at the blossom end, you check calcium and your watering schedule. But if your entire garden looks weak, then you are dealing with a completely different story. Every plant you put in the ground grows slowly. The soil turns hard after every watering. Water struggles to soak down deep. You feed the garden because you are worried, and the plants green up for a few days, then fade again. There are almost no earthworms. There is none of that rich, earthy smell of living, moist soil, and the ground no longer feels loose or crumbly in your hands. At that point, the problem is no longer in one leaf or one root. The problem is in the soil itself. One of the biggest mistakes we make as gardeners is treating soil as nothing more than material that holds the plant upright. But soil is not just a support system. Soil is a living ecosystem. Inside a healthy handful of soil, there is organic matter, beneficial fungi, earthworms, tiny air pockets, channels for water to move through, and billions of microorganisms working day and night to help plant roots access nutrients. But when soil is low in organic matter, depleted of microbial life, and packed tight from compaction, roots struggle to go deep. Water struggles to soak in. Air cannot move through. And no matter how much fertilizer you pour on top, that lifeless soil cannot hold it, process it, or pass it to the plant in a steady way. That is why you can feed the garden and see a short burst of green, but the plants never stay strong for long. To wake this kind of soil back up, the first answer is not a stronger fertilizer. What the soil needs is a biological spark, and fermented rice water can be one of the gentlest ways to feed the microbial life underground. Rice water contains starches and dissolved nutrients. When you pour it into a jar, cover it loosely, not sealed tight, and leave it at room temperature for 3 to 5 days. Fermentation begins. Microorganisms start to multiply, and one of the most important groups in that process is lactic acid bacteria. When the jar develops a light sour smell, something almost like a mild ferment, dilute it. Use about 1 part fermented rice water to 10 parts clean water. Then pour it around the root zone. But please remember this: fermented rice water does not replace compost, and it is not a miracle cure that brings lifeless soil back to life overnight. It works best when the soil already has some organic matter for microbes to cling to, feed on, and break down. The second, stronger way to rebuild soil structure is aged manure tea, and the word aged matters. It is not fresh manure. It is not waste taken straight from the barn. It is manure that has gone through the composting process, stabilized, cooled down, and become far less likely to burn roots or carry dangerous pathogens when handled properly. The method is almost exactly like brewing a giant tea bag. Place aged manure into a cloth bag. Submerge it in a bucket of water for 3 to 5 days. When the water turns the color of weak tea, Dilute it again at about 1 part manure tea to 10 parts clean water. Then pour it around the root zone in the early morning or late afternoon. Each kind of manure has its own character. Aged chicken manure is strong and nutrient-rich. It can help exhausted plants recover, but it must be used carefully. Aged cow manure is more balanced. It is one of the best choices for slowly rebuilding loose, healthy soil. Rabbit manure is much gentler. Many gardeners consider it a safer gift for young, tender roots. But this is the part you must never skip. Natural does not mean careless. Do not use fresh manure. Do not use a brew that is too strong. Do not pour it on in the heat of midday. And with leafy greens, do not use manure tea too close to harvest unless you are completely confident in the safety and cleanliness of your source. The ultimate goal is to feed the soil, not to bring extra pathogen risks onto your family's dinner table. Remember this clearly. Fertilizer can feed a plant for a few days, but only living soil can carry a plant through an entire season. By this point, you now have a method for each specific signal. But in the real world, plants do not always show just one symptom. A plant that has been sitting in a pot for too long may have yellow leaves, poor flowering, weak roots, and exhausted soil all at the same time. It may simply be worn out after a long season. And that is when we come to the final part of today's video. A full-spectrum recovery brew, not to replace diagnosis, but to serve as a deep restorative tonic for the most depleted, exhausted plants in the garden. In textbooks, every plant problem has its own clean, separate symptom. But in a real garden, things are never that simple. A plant that has been sitting in the same pot for too long may have yellow leaves, poor flowering, weak roots, and tired soil all at once. A tomato plant that has carried a heavy crop all season may have been drained of nearly every mineral reserve it had. And when a plant is exhausted in several ways at once, you should never try to fix it by pouring one strong fertilizer at the base. What it needs instead is a gentle recovery meal. Something with several ingredients, but diluted properly, used at the right time, and never, absolutely never used as a replacement for diagnosis. So now, we are going to make a full-spectrum recovery brew from the scraps already sitting in your kitchen. But before we begin, I want to make one agreement with you. This is not a cure-all. It does not replace a soil test. It does not replace compost. And it will not save a plant with damaged roots or a plant being attacked by pests. It only makes sense when a plant is showing several mild deficiency signs at the same time, or when it has just come through a long, exhausting season of flowering and fruiting. Every ingredient in this jar has its own biological mission. First, banana peels. They represent potassium and organic matter. But set your expectations correctly. A banana peel is not an instant potassium fertilizer. It needs time to break down. So do not soak it for a few hours and expect the plant to burst into bloom overnight. Second, finely ground eggshells. They are a long-term source of calcium carbonate. But as we said earlier, they are not an emergency cure. They break down slowly and are better used to build healthier soil over time. Third, used coffee grounds. They add organic matter and a small amount of slow-release nitrogen. But do not overdo them. Coffee grounds do not make soil dramatically more acidic the way many people claim. And if you spread them too thickly, they can smother the soil and interfere with seed germination. Fourth, Epsom salt. Add it only if the plant is showing signs of magnesium deficiency, yellowing leaves with green veins. If that symptom is not there, skip it completely. Fifth, blackstrap molasses. This is the heart of the formula. It is not there to feed sugar to the plant. It is there to provide a rich carbon source for the microbes. But remember, only a small spoonful. Too much molasses can push the brew into uncontrolled fermentation. The method is simple. Chop the banana peel into small pieces to increase the surface area. Add it to a jar with eggshells that have been rinsed, dried, and ground into a fine powder. Add 1 small spoonful of used coffee grounds. Add Epsom salt only if the plant truly needs it. And finally, add 1 spoonful of blackstrap molasses. Pour warm water into the jar. Stir it well to wake up the microbial life. Cover it loosely and place it in a shaded spot for 3 to 5 days. After it has steeped, strain off the liquid. And before using it, you must dilute it. Pour it only around the root zone. Never spray it on the leaves. Do not apply it under the burning midday sun. And do not use it every single day. The power of this formula is not in cramming in as many ingredients as possible. Its power is in balance. Used correctly, it can return a little life back to tired soil. But used carelessly, too strong, too often, or on roots that are already waterlogged, it can push a struggling plant even closer to collapse. So dilute it well. Pour it at the root zone. Step back and watch the plant patiently. Because, my friends, healthy soil always begins with understanding and stability, never with a miracle recipe. We have taken a long journey through every leaf and every handful of soil. Now, let me bring everything together into a quick diagnostic guide. You may want to pause the video here and take a screenshot. But first, I need to be clear. This is not a chart that tells you with 100% certainty what disease your plant has. It is a compass. It helps you know which direction to check first. Instead of seeing a weak plant and blindly pouring on fertilizer, first, if the older leaves near the bottom are turning evenly yellow and the plant is growing slowly, think first about nitrogen. Scientifically, nitrogen is a mobile nutrient. When the plant runs short, it pulls nitrogen out of the older leaves and sends it toward the young shoots. You can try a diluted fermented vegetable scrap fertilizer, but only if the soil is not waterlogged and the roots are still healthy. Second, if the leaf turns yellow between the veins, but the veins stay deep green, think about magnesium. Magnesium is at the heart of chlorophyll structure and photosynthesis. You can add Epsom salt, but be very careful and only use it when this exact symptom is present. Third, if the plant is lush and green, but has few flowers or keeps dropping blossoms, do not rush to add more nitrogen. This may be a nutrient balance problem. The plant may be short on potassium, overloaded with nitrogen, or stressed by weather and uneven watering. Reduce nitrogen, stabilize moisture, and support it gently with onion peel tea. Fourth, if the fruit has a dark sunken patch at the bottom, this is a structural breakdown connected to a lack of calcium inside the fruit tissue. But remember this clearly, it is not always because the soil lacks calcium. Often, the water flow inside the plant has been interrupted, and calcium cannot move up into the fruit. Mulch the soil to keep moisture even, and use powdered eggshells only as a long-term support. Fifth, if the leaf edges are brown, dry, brittle, or the leaves are curling, do not immediately think about fertilizer. This may be osmotic stress caused by heat, water imbalance, or sucking insects. Check the underside of the leaves. Give the plant shade if needed. Correct the watering before adding any more nutrients. Sixth, and finally, if the entire garden is weak, if fertilizer only makes the plants green for a few days before they fade again, if the soil is hard and water struggles to soak in, look down at your feet. That soil may be losing its living microbial network. Wake it gently with fermented rice water and aged manure tea. Seventh, and if a plant is showing too many complicated symptoms at once, soothe it with a gentle, full-spectrum recovery meal, the diluted Kitchen Recovery Brew. As we close today's video, I want you to remember just one thing. Never stand in front of a struggling plant and ask only, what fertilizer is this plant missing? Ask better questions. Did this sign begin on the older leaves or the new growth? Did it appear after a scorching heat wave, after heavy rain, or right after you fed the plant too strongly? Is the soil dry, waterlogged, or compacted? Are there sucking insects hiding underneath the leaves? And most importantly, is the soil beneath that plant still alive? When you begin asking the right questions, you will use less fertilizer, but you will use it with far more precision. And that is how a gardener begins to truly understand the language of nature. The next time you walk out into the garden and see a yellow leaf fall to the ground, do not treat it as the end of the story. Treat it like a message, not so we can rush to a conclusion, but so we can begin asking the right questions. Older lower leaves turning evenly yellow may be saying, I am pulling everything I have left to feed the new growth. I need nitrogen. A leaf turning yellow between the veins while the veins stay deep green may be saying, the center of my chlorophyll is weakening. I need magnesium. A plant that is lush, green, and full of leaves but refuses to flower may be saying, I need the delivery truck called potassium, or you are feeding me out of balance. A fruit with a dark, sunken bottom may be saying, my cell walls are collapsing. I need calcium carried to me through a steady flow of water. And if the entire garden is weak, if the soil is hard, earthworms are scarce, and water struggles to soak in, that is the soil itself sighing, I need to come back to life. And you know something? Many of the answers to those cries for help do not necessarily sit inside an expensive bag of fertilizer at the garden store. They may already be sitting in onion skins, rice water, spoiled vegetables, banana peels, eggshells, coffee grounds, or aged manure, the very things we once called waste. But please remember, natural does not mean careless. Dilute properly, pour at the root zone, watch patiently, and always read the signal before you intervene. Now, it is your turn to talk with me. Leave a comment below this video and tell me, what sign is your plant showing right now? Are the leaves turning evenly yellow? Are they yellow between the veins? Are the flowers dropping? Is the fruit breaking down at the bottom? Are the leaves curling? Or is the soil simply never healthy, no matter what you plant? I will read your comments and use your real garden problems to make the next part. How to read each type of leaf and know what your plant needs. Because when you learn to read the leaves, you are not just saving one plant. You are learning the language of the whole garden again.